I believe that we are very broken. I have never met a non-broken person in my life. And the consequence of our brokenness is that we tend to steward our resources. We tend to steward the things in our life in order that we might use them for self. And consequently, we become self-referential, we become self-serving, and so on. How do we break out of that? And I think we have to go back and maybe look at something very fundamental, that God made us in his image. Each of us is a unique expression of it. It was Dante who wrote the Divine Comedy. He also wrote another book called The De Monarchia. And in that book, he said, function precedes essence. The purpose that God has for each of us was there in the mind of God before he ever created the universe. He had a purpose for us, and therefore, when he created us, he gave us the essence that we needed so that we could fulfill that purpose. The essence would include personality, gifts, life shaped by circumstances, experiences, and what we could learn from those experiences, even through our failures. God had purposes and gave us the essence and experiences we needed to fulfill those purposes. So that's all great. We're made in his image to serve like Christ served. Problem is, something happened and we do not naturally tend to express that image or fulfill our purpose. Something's gone wrong. And so we look at it in scriptures. Of course, we know about the fall. We know about sin. The Greek word for sin is hamartia. The doctrine of sin is called hamartiology. Hamartia was an archer's term. The archer would take the arrow from the quiver, knock it in the bow, shoot it at the target, and if he missed the mark, that was called a hamartia. What was the mark that we missed? What were we doing? I would suggest to you we tried to play God when we broke away from him. We tried to be our own God. And a matter of fact, the scriptures say that in Romans 3:23, for all have sinned, and what did we fall short of? What was the target we missed? We've fallen short of the glory of God. You've got it again in 1 John 3:4. It says, sin is lawlessness. It's not antinomian. Nomos is the Greek word for law. It's anamos. It's to live without God's law. It's to live basically unrestrained. It's to live as an anarchist, basically. And again, serving only self. Sin, man playing God of his own life, estranges us from God. It estranges us from our neighbor. It even estranges us from ourself. We have the division between head and heart, spirit and flesh, and it certainly estranges us from fulfilling God's purposes in our life. Characteristics of these estrangements and divisions is self-referentialism. There's a word that is used too called akrasia or akrasia. Krasia is the Greek word for command. You put the alpha negation on it, and we lose command of our moral life. We lose command of our purposive life because, again, we're in it for ourselves. We justify our bad decisions. I come to a mystical moment when I make a bad decision. I can either repent of it and get back on track to fulfill the purposes God has for me, or I begin to make all kinds of self-justifications and excuses, and I lose command of my moral life. C.S. Lewis said the very first problem in life is how do you fit the stone in the shell? He took the image from a poem by an English poet named um, Wordsworth, who in his poem, The Prelude, has a Bedouin shepherd coming along with a shell and a stone. The stone represented reason, the shell represented the longings of the heart. How do you fit the stone in the shell once we've been estranged? And basically, C.S. Lewis says the only person who could put the pieces back together is God once they're broken. And we need to learn about this. We want to restore the image of Christ, or be at least in process of seeing that image restored to a kind of wholeness that is undivided and therefore can be focused again on the purposes that God has for us. The gospel restores and reconciles these estrangements. We're born again, but we're not born to stay at our birth rate. our born-again birth rate. My oldest son was 9 pounds, 4 ounces when he was born. I was very pleased. I thought some professional football team was going to come offer him a contract real soon. I was very pleased he was so big and had a good start in life. I don't know if if my wife was quite as excited about him being so big, but he's 47 now. And it would be tragic if he was still weighing in at 9 pounds, 4 ounces. There are many Christians who have been born again, but they're still weighing in to get their born again birth rate. And it's not so good. And consequently, as a result of their immaturity, they're not producing fruit and they're not engaged in a life that is purposive. There was a man named Dawson Trotman. He founded the Navigators, that ministry. He preached a sermon once called Born to Reproduce. In our maturation, we're born to reproduce. And he said a person is physiologically mature when they could reproduce physiologically, and a person is spiritually mature when they could reproduce spiritually. That is, lead a person to Christ, disciple and nurture that person so that person could go lead another person to Christ. I met a man once named David Morkin. We had lunch together. He had traveled America preaching with Dawson Trotman. And I said, tell me Trotman's stories. The guy intrigues me. And he said, well, there's one I like to tell. I was with Trotman and we were in the Pacific Northwest. I can't remember if it was Seattle or Portland, Oregon or something. But he said it was a large church and the pastor of the church was a guy Trotman led to Christ and discipled. And after the pastor introduced Trotman that way, Trotman steps into the pulpit, calls the pastor back to his side, and says to the pastor, point me to somebody in this congregation you led to Christ and discipled. Can you imagine that? So the pastor points to Matt in the back of the sanctuary, and Trotman says, Matt, stand up. You point me to somebody in this congregation you led to Christ and discipled. Matt points across the way to Steve. Steve, stand up. Point me to somebody in this congregation you led to Christ and discipled. He pointed to Sylvia. Sylvia, stand up. Point me to somebody in this congregation you led to Christ and discipled. I'm hearing this story and I'm amazed. And Morkin said it went like that for 7 generations. And I said, well, that's amazing. And there's the tragedy in the church. The normative has become the amazing. And the question for us is simply this: how do we get back to that place where we're not so concerned about self and we're pouring ourselves into the lives of others, fulfilling God's purpose as we seek to serve Him by serving them? And that means then marshaling our resources, being good stewards of what we have in order that we could use them for kingdom purposes. We live in a broken world, and even the circumstances we encounter in that world, when approached rightly, can become assets and not liabilities if we're learning and growing from those circumstances. So I want to spend the rest of our time, I'll get started on one before we take our midway break, and then I'll do the other image, these 2 images I want to use to explain how we can grow, how we can fix the divisions in our life, how we can mold and mend, and how we can serve. I'm taking my lead for these things from Ephesians 4:12. It says the role of the pastor teacher is to equip the saints for the work of ministry. The Greek word there for equip is katartismos, verb form katartizo. And you've got Kittle's Theological Dictionary. There's about 60 to 80 pages on katartismos. What does that word mean? It had many uses in secular Greek at the time the New Testament was written, but primarily 2. The first, it was a medical term, and it meant to mend, to take a broken bone and set it in order that it might mend so it could be functional once again. Another use of the term was a nautical term. It was to rig a ship for full sail so it could leave the harbor and fulfill its purpose. Basically, what God wants to do is He wants to mend us and He wants to deploy us. And I think that's the work of the pastor teacher who is moving towards wholeness in his own life. He sees people as people who are broken. How can I nurture them and see them mended? And how can I deploy them so that they could be useful in reproducing reproducers? That's the mark of maturity. in the Christian life. So here's these two images I want to use. The first one I want to suggest to you is that our life is like an old phonograph record. Do you guys remember what phonograph records are? When I would say to my students, you know what phonograph records are, they're clueless. You can't even say CDs anymore because they're doing everything digital. But I say a record was uh, a flat platter that had grooves in it. You put it on the record player, you put the needle in the record, and it begins to play out its themes. And invariably in a broken world, those records would get scratched. And when they got scratched, you remember what they would do? They would skip. They would go round, go round, go round, go round. In this fallen world, I would suggest to you that each of us has anywhere from 3 to 5 pretty deep scratches in our record. And we tend to play these things over and over and over again to get past the stuck place. And consequently, we're not ready to concentrate on offering ourselves to the benefit of others because we're too broken in our own life. If you're driving down the road and somebody cuts you off, if you honk the horn at them, that's one thing. But if 20 miles down the road, you're still tailgating that person, honking your horn at them, screaming obscenities at them, that's not about that person cutting you off. That's you playing out that brokenness, that scratch in your record in that circumstance. If they hire somebody new at work and you don't get along with them, and somebody says, why don't you get along with them? You just met them. Say, I don't know, bad chemistry, I guess, something like that. Probably that person awakens in you a broken spot where you haven't mended yet. And consequently, you're not going to be ready to serve them or use your resources to help them because you're too concerned about what's going on inside. A lot of times you'll see in marriages, there'll be recycled things in our marriage where they keep coming up year after year, month after month. And my guess is it's because in our marriages where we get so close to each other, we awaken these things or we have conflict over these things that haven't been resolved. It's not about our spouse. It's about what's broken in us that hasn't ever been fixed. And so we're divided and we're not whole and we're not ready to serve as we might. Now, I would suggest to you that we look for surrogates with whom we can work this stuff out with. And so there you go. But we also do these anesthetizing behaviors, these behaviors that don't get us better, but they deaden the pain temporarily and get us by. And there are obvious anesthetizing behaviors. There's drug addiction, there's alcohol addiction, there are eating disorders. You could have workaholism, and many people who get involved in ministry, that's an easy one to fall into because they think that if they work harder, people will really start to appreciate them. It's sort of almost a messiah complex they could develop. And so these things deaden the pain. I've worked with a few rough motorcycle type people, with the leather jackets and the real rough behavior. Everyone I've gotten close to had a marshmallow heart. And that behavior of exhibiting a rough veneer was basically a way they tried to cover up what was soft in their heart and broken and hurt and wounded so many times. I know a man who creates chaos in his life so people's eyes will be distracted to the chaos out there rather than notice the chaos that it's in his own heart. I think as we age and we mature, we develop convictions. And we begin to find that our convictions go contrary to the behaviors that we've gravitated towards. Those behaviors, again, deaden the pain, but they don't heal the wound. And we find ourselves kind of in a Romans 7 situation where the very thing we desire to do, we don't do. And the thing we find ourselves doing is not something we want to do. And we cry out, "Oh, wretched man that I am, who will set me free from this body of sin and death?" Why do we keep going back to the bad behaviors when we know with our convictions that those are inappropriate? Why does this dividedness begin to manifest itself in that way? I have a theory that it's because our wounds are deeper than our convictions. Our wounds are deeper than our convictions. And we may have convictions, but we'll keep going back to the bad behaviors because we just want to deaden the pain. And we haven't been patient enough to learn how Christ can mend us. There's katartismos again, how he can mend us so that he might deploy us. So this one image that I have in mind of a person who got better. And this is a very tender story to me. It's a story in all my years of ministry, it's the third worst story I've ever heard of a person who was so beat up, but he got better. It's about a young boy, and he's raised in a very dysfunctional family. He is physically abused. He is certainly psychologically abused. I don't think he was sexually abused, but there could have been that there too. I'm not sure. But I know he had a terrible experience. It was a large family, and he was the brunt of all the grunt. And when he's 17 years old, he's kicked out of the family, has no visible means of support. He's clever, he gets work, and he begins to move up the ladder at his place of work. And when he reaches the top of the ladder that he could get, given his limited circumstances and opportunities, somebody at work filed a sexual harassment charge against him. I'm convinced the guy was innocent, but he was put in prison for this, and he was put in prison for 7 years. One of my college roommates on his 6th anniversary slit his wife's throat and murdered her. He went to prison for 3 years. Here's this other guy who did nothing wrong, but for trumped up charges, he goes to prison for 7 years. He's got lots of scratches in his record, doesn't he? Can he get better? And in fact, I know that he did. And you guys know whose story I just told, by the way. I just told you the story of Joseph in the Bible. Raised in a large family, he suffers horrible abuse in that family from his brothers. Well, why did they abuse him like they did? Because his father Jacob preferred him over the brothers. And if anybody should have known better than doing that kind of thing, it should have been Jacob, who was the young son of his father Isaac, who preferred Esau over him. We could probably go back even a generation earlier. There's a lot of ambiguity in the situation with Abraham, Ishmael, and Isaac. But nevertheless, here's Jacob preferring Joseph, setting him then in opposition to his brothers. It's not Joseph's doing, but he suffered greatly because of it. His brothers take him, sell him into slavery to a bunch of Ishmaelites who go down to Egypt and sell him to Potiphar. Potiphar sees his gifts, elevates him in his home, puts him in charge of everything. Potiphar's wife comes on to him. Joseph is circumspect, runs from her. And yet she brings a charge against him, and he goes to prison for 7 years. Can he get better? He does. And we have the notes on how he got better by what he names his 2 sons. When he's elevated second only to Pharaoh in Egypt, he's given the priest's daughter for a wife, and he has two children. First son's name is Manasseh. Manasseh. Manasseh, I like to say to people, do you know what Manasseh means? And a lot of times people go, I don't know. I used to know. And I'll say, well, what happened? And they'll say, well, I forgot. And I go, that's it. That's what it means. Manasseh means I forgot. Because Joseph said, God made it possible for me to forget what happened in my father's house. How did that happen? And I think it doesn't mean that he couldn't remember what happened in his father's house, but I think he was able to grieve and forgive what happened in his father's house till it didn't hold him anymore, till the broken pieces had a chance to come back together and be mended so that he could go and serve the purposes that God had him for. How does it work? I mean, when the brothers come to buy grain, he asks them, do you have any other brothers? If 10 brothers came to buy grain from you, would you ask them, well, there's 10 of you, are there any more? That's not the question you would ask, but he asks it because he knows there's another brother, Benjamin, and I think he's trying to find out, why isn't Benjamin here? Did you guys sell him off someplace too? Do I need to go rescue him someplace? He gives them a dinner. He hasn't disclosed who he is. And he gives them a dinner and he seats them in chronological order of their birth. He remembers details. What does he mean, I forget? I think it meant he forgave to the forget place. If you have some deep pain in your life and you've got some time on your hand, you're going to go for a couple of hour drive to some city somewhere, I think your mind will gravitate towards unresolved pain. You want to turn on the radio or put in earbuds or something like that and sort of anesthetize with sound rather than going into that room. No, sit with it. Sit with it. And you'll remember. You'll get sad all over again. Maybe even weep. Maybe get angry. But after about 2 hours, after you sit with it, you bring it around to the forget place. A couple hours, a couple of weeks later, you have a long drive, you go back to that same place again. Because forgiving and grief are almost synonymous. They have to happen side by side. If a person says to you, I'll forgive you, but I'll never forget, they don't know what forgiveness is. To get it to a place where it doesn't hold you anymore, to keep you from bitterness. Anne Lamott, an American author, said, bitterness is like you drinking the rat poison and then you waiting for the rat to die. No, you've got to let time pass. You got to process. So next time it takes an hour and 45 minutes. Next time it takes an hour and 30 minutes. Next time an hour and 15 minutes. Next time it takes 3 hours. You have a relapse. But as you're working on grieving and forgiving, drawing on the great resources of God's power to forgive you, how can we be petty with one another when He's forgiven us so much? Eventually, the memory of the sorrow and the forgiveness become simultaneous. And at that moment, Manasseh is born in your life. Now, there's another son, and that other son's name is Ephraim. And Ephraim means be fruitful. Okay, so Joseph's second son is Ephraim, which means be fruitful. Move on to the purposes that God has for you. We have to assume from that even the bad things that we've experienced, God is weaving that errant thread into the fabric of our life so that we will be maximally purposive in our service of others. This is very important, I think. And it leads me to this second model, the second model. Because God wants to make us, I think, whole, undivided, and able to serve others. If I'm too focused on self, I won't serve others. I'm just always worried about myself rather than seeing that I'm made whole by Christ and I can serve Him and others. So the other image I have is I think that we all have to pass through 3 rooms in our life. It's just for sake of analogy. If there's 3 rooms, there could be 3,003. But for the sake of this analogy, 3 rooms. The first room I would like to call the Goodwill Hunting Room. I don't know if you saw that movie. If you haven't, I hope maybe one day you can. It's about a young boy who is incredibly brilliant, Einstein level genius, but he's been horribly abused in the foster system and so on. And he's working as a custodian at MIT University. The boy, Will Hunting, is played by Matt Damon, and he is cleaning up the building, and there's a professor in that building. And that professor has won the Fields Award, which is even better than the Nobel Prize in mathematics. And this professor is very full of himself, very arrogant. And he says to the students in his class, I got a problem on the board back there. And if anybody in this class can solve that problem, fat chance you're going to do it. But if anybody does solve the problem, I'll get you a job working for 6 figures right out of college. The next day, the kids show up and the problem is solved. The professor knows he's in the presence of genius. Who solved the problem? None of the students will raise their hand. And he doesn't know what's going on. So he puts another problem the next day on the board and he says, all right, smarty pants, whoever you are out there, I want you to know that this problem that's on the board right now is a problem that took me 2 years, the Fields Medal winner, 2 years to solve. The gauntlet is thrown. Let's see if you can solve that one, smarty pants. And the next day they come to class and the problem is solved. And this professor knows he's in the presence of absolute genius. He puts another problem on the board. And the next evening, working late at night with his TA, they come out of the office and here's a custodian solving the problem. They go chasing after him. He runs off and they go, wow, it's right. It's the right answer. So next day he goes to the custodial office to see if he can find this guy. And the custodian said, no, he's got a lot of trouble. He's a guy from the foster system. He's been arrested a bunch of times. He violated probation. He got arrested. He's in jail. So the professor goes to the court and says, I want you to release this guy to me. And they said they will, but you've got to get him in psychological care if you want us to release him to you. So the professor takes Will Hunting around to these different psychologists he knows. Psychologists at Harvard University, psychologists at MIT, some of these top guys who have written all these books. And Will Hunting, the night before he goes, he's got photographic memory. He reads their books, and every time this professor takes him to one of these psychologists, Will Hunting ties him up in knots. And they say, I don't want anything to do with him. The professor's gone through his whole list, and he's got one other option. His old college roommate, played by Robin Williams. It's the only movie Robin Williams won an Academy Award for. He takes him to him. And Robin Williams, this professor doesn't have any real respect for Robin Williams because Robin Williams, rather than going on and making a name for himself in the academy and so on, Robin Williams has gone back to the old neighborhood. And he's worked with kids who are beat up, kids who have been through tough times. And Robin Williams is teaching psychology, and he has a little psychology practice on the side. The professor comes to the door of his classroom. The first thing you hear Robin Williams say is, if you want to get through to a person's heart, you've got to develop trust with that person. And the professor just breaks in the door. Classroom's going on. Doesn't make any difference. The professor, he's so important, he could just break in. Robin Williams says, oh, students, this is my old college roommate, the Fields Medal winner. You know, we're so fortunate to have him come to our class. And it disrupts the whole class. They have to dismiss the class. And the professor says, I got this kid, and I want to know if you'll meet with him. Professor can't have the kid released him unless he's got somebody meeting with him, some psychologist. That's what the court said. And Robin Williams looks at him and says, where was I on your list? You didn't take him to that guy at Harvard, did you? Oh, man, how could you do that? You didn't take him to that guy at MIT, did you? Wow. Yeah, I'll meet with him. So he brings Will Hunting to the Robin Williams office the next day, and the professor takes a seat like he's going to sit down and watch the whole thing. Robin Williams says, you leave. You get out of here. And then he starts to talk to Will Hunting. And Will Hunting ties Robin Williams up in a knot. And Robin Williams has him by the throat. And Will Hunting says, I think the therapy session's over. Robin Williams knows he got his goat. He says, I'll see you next week. The next week they come, they take a walk. They go to Boston Gardens where the swan boats are paddling by and the swans are swimming by. And in that lazily moment, Robin Williams says, you know, you're really smart. And I thought a lot about you last week, and I thought about you till well into the night. He said, you have read about art, and you probably know all kinds of stuff about it because you got it from a book, but you've never actually been to the Sistine Chapel and seen the vibrancy of that Michelangelo painting on the roof, or seen the vibrancy of its color, or smelled what it was like to be in that room. You've read about war. Robin Williams was a Vietnam vet, and he had his best friend cradled in his lap who bled to death from wounds. He says, you've read about war, but you don't know what it's like to see your best friends die beside you in the midst of battle. He says, you've read about love. Maybe you've been late a time or two. I don't know. But you don't know what it's like to have your wife die and be dying in a hospital bed, and you will not leave her side. And all the people in the hospital, the doctors and nurses, know that the signs that say visiting hours are over don't apply to you because you're not leaving her. He says, you don't know because you've only learned it from a book. He says, you're an orphan, aren't you? And Matt Damon kind of hangs his head, says, yeah. Robin Williams says, what would you think if I told you I know all about it? I read Oliver Twist once. Robin Williams says to him, I want to get to know you, and I can't get to know you from a book, and I'm here for you. So the next week they come back, and Matt Damon's character, Will Hunting, he doesn't say a thing the whole time, whole hour. Professor comes and said, did you fix him? Did you fix him? Because the professor wants him fixed so he can use him. Will Hunting knows what it's like to be used because he's been used all of his life. And Robin Williams says to the professor, he didn't say a thing the whole hour. And the professor says, is that good? Robin Williams says, very impressive, actually. Because basically what Robin Williams knows is that if Matt Damon doesn't give him what he wants, will Robin Williams abandon him? And remember, Robin Williams had said, you have to cultivate trust. You don't develop trust by using people. Well, eventually it opens up, and they have so many of the sections of that movie are therapy sessions with Robin Williams and Matt Damon, the Will Hunting character. And eventually he starts to get better. And eventually he breaks through some of these things, these deep wounds of the heart, and consequently starts to mend as we need to, starts to mend. They don't have a Christ element. It's a secular movie, but nevertheless, the picture is there. And so Robin Williams finally, when things are getting better, he pulls out all these pictures from uh, from Will Hunting's file, pictures of abuse, people burning cigarette butts on his arm, putting him out, knife wounds, battery wounds, bruises, and so on. And he puts them on the table, and Will Hunting says, pretty bad, isn't it? Robin Williams says, yeah. And Will Hunting says, do you know anything about this? Robin Williams says, yeah, I do. He says, no, no, no. I don't mean, do you know about my file? Do you know about this kind of behavior, this kind of wound, this kind of hurt? And Robin Williams says, yeah, actually, I do. And they talk about the brokenness they've each experienced. And then Robin Williams says something to the Will Hunting character. It's the most important line in the whole movie. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. What happened to you wasn't because of you. You don't have to bear that burden anymore. It's not your fault. And Will Hunting's character just laughs it off. Yeah, I know, I know. He's deflecting, but he hasn't let it sink inside. So Robin Williams says it again. It's not your fault. Will Hunting says, I know, I know. Robin Williams says, it's not your fault. I know. It's not your fault. He says, stop messing with me, man. And all of a sudden the solstice is lanced and the pus comes out and he falls in Robin Williams' arms, weeping and weeping. That's the Good Will Hunting room. Everybody has to come to that place in life. In this broken world, we've picked up plenty of wounds and bruises. And we begin to interpret ourselves accordingly. But those were not things that were our fault. And we need to know that. But that's only the first room. And if we leave out at that place, then we think we've got an excuse for all the bad we're doing to people. We think, oh, it's not our fault. We were wounded, so therefore it's okay. We have carte blanche to go hurt other people. No, you got to go into the second room. And the second room is a very, very dark room. Luke 6:40 says, a pupil fully trained will be like his teacher. Doesn't mean we know what the teacher knows, but we pick up by contagion the teacher's attitude, the teacher's demeanor, decorum. And that could be not only for good, the disciples learning stuff like that from Jesus, but it could be from bad. If we've been hurt, my guess is we picked up by contagion how to hurt other people. Remember, there was Joseph, who was hurt by his brothers, who were hurt by Jacob, but Jacob was hurt by his father, and we go on back and forth. You think for a second, do you know the names of your 8 great grandfathers or grandparents, your 8 great grandparents? Most people can't remember, but it says in the Bible, the sins of the parents are visited on the children of the 3rd and 4th generation. You are affected and living in the shadow of people whose names you don't even remember. And not only that, you're casting a shadow for the people who won't know your name. And this is the way it is and the way it's described in Scripture. And we need to recognize this has been so from time immemorial since the fall. And we need, as Christians, to learn about this so we can mend, so we could be people who could go and be servicing other people, helping them to get past the wounds in their life so that they could get better. So becoming whole, they could fulfill the purpose that God had for them. Even seeing how the brokenness can be threads woven into the fabric of God's calling in that person's life. And this becomes extremely important. And once we learn this, then we realize, you know what, we've done a fair share of damage. We need to go back and set that right with other people. And if you've hurt somebody, you go back and ask their forgiveness. But as you ask their forgiveness, you're saying in your own mind at that moment, if they only knew I was doing the best I knew how. You never say that to a person when you ask their forgiveness because it muddies the water of, are you really sincere when you ask forgiveness? No, you own it. You own the bad you've done. But when the light goes on where you say, if they only knew I was doing the best I knew how, that probably means the people who hurt you were also doing the best they knew how, but they were carrying their own burden of sorrow and brokenness and so on. And once you realize that, it accelerates forgiveness backwards. And it makes it easier for you to forgive other people, drawing on the rich reservoir of God's forgiveness for you, his unconditional love for you, so you and that strength can go and be a lover, a forgiver. And that's the threshold of the 3rd room. The 3rd room is full of glory and light. It is the wounded healer room. It is the room that recognizes you can go out with greater empathy, greater tenderness, greater wisdom that you learned even from the brokenness in a fallen world. And you can go and minister to other people and encourage them. And that means then you can steward all of your resources, your time, your energy, your talent, even your financial resources, and to use it in a way that is strategic and in a way that encourages and lifts up and helps other people to be all that they might be in Christ. And I think this light room is learning to live on purpose without distraction, to serve God's purposes undivided. Cease to be self-referential, making everything about us, and instead actually sets people free to meet the needs of others instead. So I would end there.